This is the third video for the genetics module, and in this video, I will talk about pedigrees and inherited diseases. So your learning objectives, you need to use a pedigree to determine whether a characteristic is dominant or recessive. I'm actually modifying that, so you just need to be able to use a pedigree to determine genotypes of specific individuals. And then you need to be able to describe the symptoms of the inherited diseases that I'll cover in this PowerPoint. This is an image of a pedigree. So a pedigree shows you how a condition, most often a disease, is inherited through generations. Several items you need to understand about pedigrees. We usually use circles to refer to females, squares to refer to males. When you're looking at the pedigree, if there is a line between a square and a circle, that means those two individuals reproduced. So here is the line going down, and these are their offspring. Now there is a line going between the offspring, but it's not directly between them, right? It's a raised line, meaning that they're siblings. But now if you look at my second generation, right here, you have a female and a male that have reproduced and have 4 offspring, 2 males, 2 females. We generally use shading for the individuals that exhibit a disease. So if you look here at the first generation, number 1 and 2, the parents, they have 2 individual offspring that do not have the disease and a male child that does have the disease. That male child with the disease goes on to reproduce and produces 3 children with the disease, 2 females and a male, and 1 without. Now, this is a recessive disease, meaning that the only way you can have the disease, exhibit the disease, is if you are homozygous recessive. So how do I know this? Well, you can choose, you can have either a dominantly inherited disease or recessive. If an individual, if it's a dominant disease and the individual has a dominant allele, they will have the disease. Meaning that if they are, let's use D, big D, little d, they have the disease. If they are big D, they have the disease. But if you look at the first generation individuals 1 and 2, they do not have the disease, yet their offspring does. That means that the disease has to be recessive and they have to be heterozygous. So this individual would be this, and this individual, will also be heterozygous. The reason that I know that is the only way that they can have an offspring with the disease. So let's do a Punnett square to illustrate this. The gametes for each parent will be a big D. Make that smaller. And we'll have a little d, and we'll have a capital D here, and a lowercase here. Meaning that their offspring have a 25% chance of being big D, a 50% chance of being big D, little d, and a 25% chance of being little d, and little d has the disease. And this is in fact what you see with the offspring. If the parents were homozygous recessive, there is no way their offspring could have the disease. Let's look at this next pedigree. This is showing you a recessive disease that is where you have mom and dad as heterozygous, meaning that they are carriers. That is exactly the same as what I showed you in the previous slide. A carrier means that they have the recessive allele, but they do not exhibit the disease, because you have to be homozygous recessive in order to exhibit the disease. Oops. Okay, so go ahead and write this down. Now I'm going to show you a pedigree, and I wrote down that you have to be able to determine the genotype of certain individuals. So I'm going to tell you that this disease you're looking at is autosomal recessive. Remember, an autosome is just a regular chromosome that codes for your body characteristics, and that is opposed to like a sex chromosome, your X or your Y chromosome. So this is autosomal recessive. Now, I want you to determine the genotype, I should say genotypes, of these two individuals. So here's how you can do that. Start by filling in all of the genotypes that you know. And those would be the deceased individuals that have the disease. So we're going to use little d. So this person has to be little d. Now, I know that because they have the disease and they're deceased. So they have to be homozygous recessive. Now, you can fill in some of the other genotypes. Now, individuals that do not have the disease have to have at least one big D. So we write it like this. Okay, I know that number 2 down here at the bottom, third generation, has to be big D. Has to have at least one big D because those individuals do not have the disease. Oops. Same goes for these individuals. Okay, now I asked you to figure out individuals 1 and 2 in the second generation. So they have an offspring with the disease. And what that tells you is that individuals 1 and 2 in the second generation have to be heterozygotes. There is no other way for them to have a child that has little d, because a little d has to come from both parents. So that is how you would figure out the genotype for those two individuals. The last part of this video is going over some recessive and dominant diseases. So the first disease I have here is albinism, which we have in the past referred to people as albino when they have albinism, but it's a lack of pigment in the hair, the eyes, and the skin. Now, this is a recessive disease. Let's say we are using the letter A. This person would have to be homozygous recessive in order to have this. This is cystic fibrosis, which is actually pretty common in our population. And there are two things I want to point out here. So first of all, cystic fibrosis occurs with an accumulation of mucus in the lungs. You can see I have a healthy lung and a cystic fibrosis lung in the picture here. What is happening is that the epithelial cells in the lungs, remember epithelial cells line your organs, so the epithelial cells in the lung are not working correctly. Here we have a protein that goes across the plasma membrane for these cells. It lets water pass through the plasma membrane. We talked about osmosis before, and water actually passes through these little channels called aquaporins. So what's happening here is this aquaporin or channel is closing. And so whereas water would pass back and forth to keep the mucus, which would be the solute, to keep the mucus diluted, that water can no longer move. So it all stays on the inside of the epithelial cell, and the mucus on the outside of the cell gets very, very thick. So that is what happens in cystic fibrosis. Here we have phenylketonuria, PKU. All newborns in hospitals are checked for PKU. What this disorder is, again, it's recessive, is in the body, the amino acid phenylalanine builds up in the bloodstream, and this can cause damage very, very quickly after phenylalanine starts building up. Within 24 hours, you get a lack of normal skin pigment, cognitive delays, so damage to the brain. There are cataracts can form. And so PKU is a very damaging disease. Now, the interesting thing about PKU is it can be treated very effectively by limiting the amount of phenylalanine that a newborn is getting through breast milk. And so newborns with this particular disease have to be given a special formula that does not contain phenylalanine. And eventually these children outgrow this disease and no longer need constraints on their diet. So a simple blood test can determine whether this is present in newborns, and we can prevent all of this damage from occurring. The other recessive disease that we've talked about before is sickle cell anemia. So remember that sickle cell anemia refers to the changing of the shape of hemoglobin in the red blood cells. So the hemoglobin becomes sickle-shaped, it deforms the red blood cells. They no longer carry oxygen in the way that they're supposed to, and it can cause organ damage. Now, remember that with sickle cell anemia, it is a recessive condition, and it occurs because of one substitution in the amino acid chain for the hemoglobin protein. Now, two dominant inherited diseases are achondroplasia and Alzheimer's, which I'll talk about next. So dominant diseases are passed on, and individual exhibits them if they are heterozygous or homozygous dominant. And so if you have an individual with a dominant disease, the children will absolutely get the disease, some of the children. So achondroplasia is called dwarfism. I'm not sure if it's still called dwarfism, but this is a dominant disease. So if you have a parent, let's do this down here. that is heterozygous for the disease, and they produce children with a partner that is homozygous recessive, your children have, or the children have a 50% chance of inheriting the disease. So let's say this is the person with achondroplasia. They're heterozygous. Their partner is homozygous recessive, so they're of normal stature. Their children can be heterozygous or homozygous recessive. And the children that are heterozygous will have achondroplasia. So there's a 50% chance, 2 out of 4 squared, that they will be heterozygous with the disease, and a 50% chance that they will not have the disease. Finally, there's Alzheimer's, which you've all probably heard of. And Alzheimer's, it's a very interesting disease, and we've been doing a lot of research on it, but there's a genetic component to Alzheimer's and then environmental factors as well. But Alzheimer's occurs because of misshapen proteins in the brain. And it seems that these misshapen proteins, right, they don't have their normal shape, spread throughout the brain. So it starts in the temporal lobe. It spreads to the lateral temporal lobe and the parietal lobes, spreads to the frontal lobe, and then finally the occipital lobe in the back. And this usually happens over like a 7-year period. So the Alzheimer's that has a genetic component is a dominant disease. So that is the last part of your genetics lecture. So remember, there's 3 videos: law of segregation, law of independent assortment, and then pedigrees and inherited diseases.